Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Ashley Griffin, a Broadway performer, writer, and theater journalist. If you're new here, welcome. Don't forget to click the subscribe button for more content from your theatrical Hermione Granger. So let's get started. With the proliferation of musicals starring children recently on Broadway, a lot of people have asked me what it was like being a child in a long-running show. I was a child actor in LA of my own volition. I don't come from an industry family, and I was the one begging my mom to let me train and go on auditions. I'll sum it up this way. One day, I got out of school early. My mom picked me up and told me, "So, your agent called and you have an audition, but you got out early today. We could go to Disneyland." I insisted I would rather go to the audition. I had the opposite of a stage mom, and I'm so grateful for her. Being a child actor for me was a gift and a joy. I know other child actors who did not have the same experience, but the story of being a child actor in general is another deep dive. Let me know if you'd like to hear more about that. This is specifically about being a child in a long-running show. When I was 11 to 13, I did about a year-long run, it might have been a little bit longer, of a musical called Mary Mary. We primarily performed in Los Angeles, but I also went with the show to the UK, touring to London, Warwick, and Stratford. The show was a kind of modern Alice in Wonderland esque story involving a cynical, grown up before her time young girl named Mary Mary, and a host of fantastic fairy tale characters. I played Mary Mary, alternating with mainly one, but for a short while with two other girls, though I ended up doing the majority of performances. Again, another long story. I was the youngest person in the cast. As a kid, I always looked older than I was, so I was the only Mary Mary who was truly playing my own age. In the show, Mary turns 13 at midnight, and I turned 13 like the second to last performance of the show, whereas the other girls were over 13 and were playing younger. But even if we had been the same age, the other Mary Marys and I were never at the theater at the same time. So I was the kid amongst adults. I loved doing Mary Mary. It will always be one of my theatrical highlights. Interestingly, in real life, I was much more like the end of the show Mary. I was in some ways a very innocent 12-year-old, very imaginative, and I saw the world in magical ways. I think I still do. My acting abilities were primarily challenged in the first half of the show when Mary is much more jaded and cool than I was. I had a very strong grasp of acting. I was in my first play when I was 5 and had been taking acting classes ever since. I grew up in LA and got an agent when I was 7. By 12, I was an old pro. I was very fortunate that I was treated as such. As I mentioned, I have friends who were also child actors, and many have horror stories of the kinds of things directors would do to them to manipulate a performance out of them. That old chestnut about a kid being told their parents are dead to get them to cry is much more common than you might think. Largely thanks to a wonderful mother and the fact that I received legitimate acting training, I was very blessed to always be treated as an equal actor and never had any traumatizing incidents. Mary Mary was a big responsibility for me. I only left the stage twice the whole show, and I was speaking off stage during both exits. I had to be at the theater very early to get ready and warm up before the performances. I used my own hair and had it French braided, 2 braids, just like Dorothy. I liked the other people who worked on the production very much. Ironically, maybe this is true to an extent with all performers, but I think it is especially with children. I remember my relationships with the other characters as separate from my relationships with the other actors. Although I certainly missed everyone when the show ended, I almost missed some of the characters more than the actors themselves, like they had been real people in a way. The actors I knew I could always see again, but I would never again be able to talk to and interact with the characters I loved so much. Mary was sometimes closer to a character on stage than Ashley was in real life with the actor who played them. I'm glad I did my first long run as a child. Children are by nature in the moment, something essential to surviving a long run, and now I have that paradigm to bring to a long run as an adult. But even as a child, it did get difficult to keep the show fresh after a while, though probably after a much longer period than one would think. It does take a decent amount of time to really get into the groove of a new show. I began to set little challenges for myself to help keep things feeling new. One show I might filter things through Mary's sadness, the next her anger. One show I might play her as a little girl pretending to be older than she is, the next is a girl who really had to grow up too fast. I never did anything that really changed my performance, just little thoughts I kept in the back of my mind to keep things interesting. One thing that really did help keep things fresh was when new cast members would join the company. As wonderful as everyone was, an especial favorite cast member for me was Rachel, who replaced the adult lead in the show a few months into the run. Not only was Rachel a former acting teacher of mine, but she was a close family friend. I spent most of my time on stage with Rachel's character, who becomes like a mother to Mary during the course of the show. It was very special for me to get to perform with her, and it made me work even harder knowing I had to rise to the level of someone I respected so much. It's interesting, now as an adult who has worked with children on stage, I'm so aware of how much love and care there is for them. But when I was a child, I was so scared that everyone would look at me as the annoying kid, and that I had to prove to them I was worthy to be in their company, that I was equal to the task of being their scene partner. I remember discovering things about the show and Mary right through the final performance. Every time a new cast member came in with a slightly different take on the role, I started to see things in the play I hadn't thought of before. Rachel played her role in a very maternal way. Cheryl was much more zany, kind of your kooky aunt, and Evelyn was closer to a Mary Poppins-esque interpretation. Each made me see the show differently, and my Mary became different in response to each of these three actresses. Though I was ready for a break by the time the show ended, I was so sad when it was over. I think when you're a child actor, there's a kind of axe hanging over you. The knowledge that you have a very limited amount of time to play a certain role, and then you'll never be able to play it again. I cried the day I realized I was officially too old to play Annie. By the time I finished my run in Mary Mary, I barely fit into the costume. I was getting tall and the costume was stretched to maximum capacity. The adults could play these roles for years, but I knew I was a ticking time bomb. You're far too aware of growing up when you're a child stage actor, whether you feel grown up or not. I think in film and TV, it's sometimes the opposite. You're kept a little girl far longer than you should be. Mary Mary was a haven for me. I was going through hell in real life, but doing the show, I, in a way, felt like I got to step into a fantasy world and be with characters I loved and who loved me. There's something magical about being in a show when you're a child, but it's also made very clear that you're expected to be just as professional as the adults in the cast. Show-wise, I was never treated any differently from anyone else. I didn't have a child wrangler like many shows involving children do. I was completely responsible for getting myself ready on time, taking care of my costume while I was wearing it, making all my entrances, and maintaining a consistent performance. Socially, however, I was treated very differently. I was at that age where I really looked up to the older girls in the company. I always wanted to do what they were doing. This was especially a problem when we were in the UK. Though I certainly had people with the production looking out for me, I didn't have someone whose responsibility it was to be with me all the time. During the day, I was the cute kid to have around. At night, no one wanted me tagging along. I was not invited to girls' nights in the hotels where they would slather on face masks and talk about the boys they were dating / sleeping with in the cast. There were a lot of places I was just too young to go. I certainly wasn't going to be going and getting a drink with the cast after a performance. And I couldn't go anywhere by myself. Can you imagine a 12-year-old trying to take the subway in a foreign country alone? Yeah, obviously, absolutely not. I had to all but beg, borrow, and steal to get someone to take me to a museum, etc. on our time off, as I said, I wasn't allowed to go anywhere on my own. I spent a lot of time alone in my hotel room, desperately missing my mom. This was an especially interesting dynamic as I was playing the lead in the show and was doing various press, photo shoots, etc. that other cast members weren't always involved in. Show-wise, I was one of the most important people. Socially, I was the least. I remember one time in LA, the whole cast decided to have a movie bonding night, and we went to go see a movie I had already seen with my mom and loved, especially because it was theater related. I remember being humiliated when we got to the theater and the box office worker deemed me too young to go inside insisting I would have to stay outside while the whole rest of the cast went in. Just FYI, this was like a PG-13 movie. This wasn't like a crazy R-rated movie or anything like that. Finally, one of the cast talked the box office attendant into letting her count as my guardian and give permission for me to see the movie. But I went from feeling like one of the group to feeling like the silly baby instantaneously. Also, what were they planning on me doing? Just standing outside the movie theater while I waited for an adult to show up and get me? Things weren't much better back at school. Especially in LA, there can be a lot of jealousy when you're a child performer. I remember one day in the 7th grade, I did an invitational performance, a special matinee show where usually schools are invited to attend as a way to supplement a lack of arts education. I'd switched schools between 6th and 7th grade. Middle school was hell for me. My first school was awful. My second, in some ways, ended up being worse. Let me know if you want to hear that story. Mean Girls. It's real! It wasn't until the 11th hour when the producers, and I, realized that one of the groups coming to the invitational was my former class. The kids thought it would be really funny to try and embarrass me as much as possible, including yelling, "Ashley, you suck," during the show and trying to trip me when I had to make an entrance down one of the aisles. That was fun. I was never exposed to anything really bad during the show. Again, I know horror stories from other kids, but I found myself a not quite comprehending bystander on the periphery of some drama on more than one occasion. There was an incident where we all got a big lecture about professional behavior from one of the producers, where the word drugs was never explicitly used, but everyone knew what he was talking about, except for me. Afterwards, I apologized to him if I had done anything wrong. He smiled and said this had nothing to do with me. I had to beg one of the cast members to tell me what was going on. There were also a multitude of hookups in the cast. I remember feeling in a weird Twilight Zone place of at once being horrified finding out that some of the people I looked up to were cheating on their significant others, who were also in the cast, and feeling slightly jealous that I seemed to be the only one no one wanted to date. As it should have been, no one should have been trying to date the 11, 12-year-old in the company. But I still felt like the, "Am I not a pretty girl, mama?" person. I remember being all but traumatized our first night in London when the company had gotten tickets to the West End play Popcorn, a brilliant work that no 12-year-old should be watching. And on the flip side, being in 7th heaven watching a World War II era Hamlet and discovering Cymbeline at the RSC. To this day, Cymbeline is my favorite of Shakespeare's romances. I loved being in the UK and am dying to perform there again. But don't get me wrong, I loved acting as a kid. I still do. Being on stage was the happiest I ever felt. It gave me an incredibly constructive way to channel my feelings, and on the practical side, it gave me many life skills. I'm great at dealing with rejection. I actually think it's a good thing for kids to start being exposed to rejection early. When I was 7, I didn't remember most auditions I did, so hearing a week later that I didn't get that snack commercial didn't leave me devastated. I usually responded with, "Oh, did I audition for that?" Pretty soon, it just became an accepted part of life. You do your best, and a lot of times you don't get the gig, and it has nothing to do with you. I got really good at interacting with adults, though I was always far more comfortable with people who were older than me than my peers anyway. I learned about professionalism. If I was tired, I couldn't just not show up to work. I learned very early that my actions affected many more people than just me, and that it was far better to be a team player. I remember the only time I've ever missed an entrance was in Mary Mary. My entrance for Act 2 was through the audience, so at the Places call, the rest of the cast would go backstage and I would wait to get the call that the lobby was clear and I could go to the front of the house. One show, I started to feel like intermission was going on for a really long time. So I snuck a look, which I wasn't supposed to do, but I snuck a look out at the lobby and saw that no one was out there. I cracked open the door to the theater and was horrified to see that the cast was halfway through the opening number and was standing frozen on stage while the music played for my solo. I had the first line after the song was over, so I just made my entrance on that line. After the show, I got a serious talking to by the director before the stage manager discovered that the monitors had gone out and I really never did get my places call. I really enjoyed meeting fans by the stage door after the show. There were lots of little girls who loved Mary like I did. I actually saw the show years before I was in it and always wanted to play Mary. A lot of young girls would celebrate their birthday by coming to the show, and I always felt so honored to be a part of something that was so special to so many people. I'm so grateful that I was allowed to pursue my passion immediately when I knew that that's what I wanted to do. And I'm so fortunate that I had a wonderful experience doing it. If there's any other questions that you have specifically about being a child actor or just the arts in general, feel free to leave a comment below, and I'd love to answer them.